I'm Mike Barthel, and this is Risk Work. Today's guest has over 35 years in public safety, which includes serving as an MP in the U.S. Army Reserves, experience as a police officer and a federal agent, 17 years of utility experience across generation, transmission, and distribution. He has a deep understanding of IT and OT infrastructures through his unique experiences across different verticals, including chemicals, petrochemical, electric, gas, and water. An accomplished security leader for major utilities and consulting partner to several energy providers, he's also an internal and external auditor that's led numerous compliance enforcement authority audits. He is the founder of nonprofit educational services firms and for-profit management consulting firms. He's authored 5 books pertaining to NERC CIP and NERC compliance. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big Risk Work welcome to Karl Perman. Yeah. Karl, how you doing today, brother?
I'm good, Michael. How are you?
I'm great. I'm hanging in there.
Thank you for that intro. It sounds like the nightclub.
Yeah, that's right. We'll be going to one of those soon, I hope.
Me too.
One of these days. Well, we're really excited to have you on the show, Karl. And, Karl and I have known each other for about 7 or 8 years. I met Karl recruiting NERC CIP professionals, my company, In Search of Energy at the time. That's what we do, and that's what we did. And in our first 3 episodes of Risk Work, we've mentioned NERC CIP, which is the set of critical infrastructure protection standards and guidelines the electric companies follow to keep its systems secure from attacks, thus providing public safety to customers. And Karl, one of the most interesting things to me about your background is the fact that you've been on both sides of this fence. You've worked directly for these energy companies, and also you worked on the compliance security side of things, which actually means you've policed the energy companies to make sure that they are secure and in compliance. And what I'd like to talk about, first of all, our viewers are not probably that familiar about NERC CIP and what it actually is. And I was kind of hoping that you could talk a little bit about, compliance and security, the field, how you got involved, and maybe kind of bullet point and talk about your background in NERC CIP, if that works.
Okay, sure, Michael. So as you eloquently said in the intro, I started off in the military, then was in local law enforcement in the Detroit area, then was a federal agent with the actual DEA. And so after a career in law enforcement, I got involved with security with the automotive sector, setting up supply chain security and global security programs for an auto manufacturer, and then got involved with the electric sector with Southern Cal Edison back in the early 2000s. So my experience with NERC CIP was actually with the predecessor of NERC CIP, which was called Urgent Action 1200. And basically that was the first real volley of, back then, voluntary reliability standards in the area of cyber, as well as delved a little bit into physical security side with that Urgent Action 1200. Urgent Action 1200 then became part of the CIP standards and mandatory compliance when FERC designated NERC as the ERO, or Electric Reliability Organization. So we went from a voluntary framework of standards to a mandatory framework of standards. As you said, NERC CIP basically consist of several standards that are aimed at the cybersecurity of what we'll call bulk electric system cyber assets or critical control systems. And then they've also gone now into a bit of physical security and communication protocols and communication protections on top of the original, we'll say 10 standards, CIP 002 through 011, and now there's CIP 12, CIP 13, and CIP 14. CIP 13, as you know, is supply chain risk management.
Right. So first of all, how well does this stuff work? Is it effective when it comes to compliance and security of the field?
That's a darn good question, Michael. So, I would be remiss to say that I've seen an actual, peer-reviewed kind of, Harvard, if you would, study on the nexus between security and reliability of the grid as far as the bulk electric system. But I would say that it definitely has helped from a resiliency and a reliability side, because security is intrinsically interwoven into reliability and resiliency. And what I mean by that is it helps with a lot of concepts that are just fundamental to running an operational effectiveness aligned utility. And what I mean by that is part of NERC CIP is, setting baselines. So basically it involves setting an asset management and configuration change management spirit or culture throughout the company. So again, I haven't seen an empirically reviewed or peer reviewed, what I'll say academic study. But I do believe just in the amount of incidents we've had versus the incidents we used to have, 10, 15, 20 years ago, that security and the CIP standards have done some good as far as improving the reliability of the grid. And frankly, that's what all this is for, right? It's not for an exercise in administration. It's to improve the reliability of the grid, to make sure when folks like you go home at night, you flip the switch on, or you grab a beer out of the refrigerator and it's cold, not warm.
I think what people maybe fail to realize sometimes is that there's so many critical infrastructures in the United States, but wouldn't you agree that the electric grid is a primary one? Because without the electric, everything else kind of falls to the
100%. I mean, without electricity, the gas doesn't flow, the water doesn't flow, the chemicals can't be made. Obviously, more and more places are kind of going to a microgrid or being responsible for their own generation of electricity, but that's usually for a matter of days or hours. So yeah, I think that electricity is the most critical of critical infrastructure.
And not to criticize NERC CIP or anything, but what are some things that we could do within NERC CIP to make it actually better or more effective? Or what do you see as maybe some of the gaps?
Oh boy, that's a tough one, Michael, because I think there's a few issues there. I mean, I'll tackle the couple because we can go on this for a few hours, if not a few days. But I think number one, NERC CIP, I don't care which standard you're talking about, is pretty fundamental stuff. So it's kind of like kindergarten for security practitioners, if you will.
Okay.
So just because I often say this a lot of times, good compliance doesn't equal good security. And that's very important for people to understand, because just because you go through an audit and you may have no findings, or you may have a couple things that were hiccups in your program, that doesn't mean you're doing a darn good job on security. I would argue that you probably aren't, because you're focused on compliance and not security. So I often tell folks that if you concentrate on good security, normally good compliance will come out of that as a byproduct, and you'll be about 80% of the way there. Now, there are some compliance administrative burdens, because you have to sustain it and keep things and be able to produce evidence and all those kind of things, demonstrate that basically you have a plan and a process, and that you're actually actioning and have implemented that plan and process. So I think as far as where they could do better would be to again, mature. I mean, the NERC standards, CIP standards have been changing. Obviously, we've gone from version 1 to now we're on version 6, 7, 8, depending upon which standard you're on.
Right.
But to continue to mature those, and not only that, but I think the regions are doing a decent job of outreach, but I think they could improve some of their outreach efforts. So more, some entities still think it's kind of like the IRS. Like if I was to knock on your door and say, "Hey, Michael, I'm the IRS. I'm here to help you do your taxes," you probably would close the door pretty quick on me and not invite me in for, a beer and to help you do your taxes.
Right.
Nor would I. And that's kind of the relationship some entities have with their compliance enforcement, with their regions and with NERC and FERC. I encourage more of a collaborative approach. Like if you have a question, or if you want to figure out what an audit approach is, call your region and say, "Hey,
Right.
What's up?" I mean, they'll tell you. They can't make a whole lot of comments outside of an audit about what you're doing, but they can give you the direction to go down, and you can kind of bounce ideas off of them. They'll be more than happy to talk to you about that. So I think more collaboration between regulators and entities and vice versa, could be a step in the right direction. And also just maturing the standards based on the real threats that are out there. So, if we see an issue like remote access, tightening up some of the controls around that versus, perhaps making a fence, 2 feet higher. So, because copper thefts were big, several years ago, and I think they're still out there. But again, targeting the kind of newer compliance standards and the revisions to those to the actual threats that are out there.
Right, and kind of to that point, one of the things I kind of heard you say in there is a little bit about changing, maybe change management, or changing cultures, and that's something we've talked about in the past on these shows. And one of the hardest things that I've heard, when it comes to that type of change, is the fact that operations is resistant a little bit to sometimes compliance or security changes. I mean, how do you mitigate through that, and how do you get through the operation barriers to actually make this stuff effective?
Yeah, that's a good question, Michael. So again, we're humans, right? So change comes tough. No one likes change, and the other thing that we're up against in the energy sector, at least particularly electricity, is the retirement bubble. And what I mean by that, there's a lot of folks that are out there that've been, multitude of decades, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years working the utility. And if you've been doing the job for 40 years, who am I to come in and tell you how to change your job? And frankly, that's the first thing you're going to tell me is,
Right.
you figured out a way to do it after 40 years. So who am I to tell you? So I think, again, it's aligning the compliance requirements with the threats, and then making an awareness campaign and tying those threats into what, say you're a system operator. Well, why should you be changing your password? Why should you be logging off your screen when you leave to go to the restroom or walk away from your desk for more than a couple minutes? Why do you have to, have a access card coming in the door? I think if we can explain to them, those system operators, that they're part of critical infrastructure, and the control room is very important because of the amount of megawatts and such that are controlled there, and explain to them about the threats that are out there from nation states as well as just hackers, and people that don't want nefarious people to come in and God forbid do some type of physical security act or electronic, break a cybersecurity, basically commit a cybersecurity hack. I think the more awareness we can do in those areas and tie that into the real threats, then the operators will get that frontline grassroots buy-in, and really, I believe in kind of what I'll call operationalizing compliance, and that means making it part of everyone's job. So writing that into the job duties, and then also educating people through numerous awareness sessions about what are the threats and what are the mitigations, why we want them to act the way we want them to act, versus just saying, hey, this is edict, this is company policy, you have to do it. So it's really getting the buy-in and the grassroots efforts from the ground up.
And it would seem like you would have to have a lot of credibility from previous experiences to make that fly.
Yeah, 100%. And you have to action it, right? So I see a lot of upper management that don't wear their badges, that don't, they don't scan in, they tailgate, etc. And
Right.
then they expect the employees to exhibit the proper behaviors. Well, that's not going to work, because the first thing the person's going to say is, hey, my boss's boss doesn't do it, so why should I?
Yeah, that's a problem.
So you've got to lead by example, right? It's,
Yeah.
it's fundamental leadership.
Well, let me transition this to the fact that you've written 5 books about NERC CIP. So I'm sitting here hammering you with questions, but the reason is because you've written all these books, and one that's really standing out to me, which I see that could really be valuable, is your book about the CIP frameworks and how you could take the CIP principles and actually apply them to different vertical industries. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you bet. And so that was actually the first book. So I co-authored that book with Terry Schurter. And Terry, you may know, he was one of the founding members, and actually was the principal architect for SigmaFlow's compliance management solution, which is still around today. It's used by many utilities as their compliance management solution. They've been bought by IP Keys, but so Terry and I all, we've kicked around a lot of fireside chats, and we both believe that that CIP is nothing more than another framework similar to like NIST and ISO and others that are out there. And so that the framework can be used across, basically to functionalize it. Like, what we encourage is people to break it down into functions like physical security, password management, etc. And then those same principles don't just have to be applied to NERC regulated entities in the electricity sector. You could use that for banking or otherwise. Now, obviously, financial, other areas, some other heavily regulated industries, you have your own compliance requirements. But again, this is a good just overall security framework to lay on top of whatever other security controls you may have, just to get into certain areas like you mentioned before, like change management and password management, and like we talked about physical security, electronic security, information protection, those kind of area, recovery, incident response, those kind of major topics that flow through the CIP framework and by standard can be applied to any vertical industry.
You mentioned NIST 800. How exactly does NERC CIP, especially version 5, how does it tie into NIST 800?
Actually, pretty well. I mean, basically, NERC CIP is in version 4 and version 5 and version 6, version 7, version 8, again depending upon the state I'm talking about, has really since version 4 adopted that NIST kind of methodology where there's now 3 impact levels, right? Low, medium, and high, depending upon the assets involved. And so really it doesn't have all the domains necessarily, it doesn't go as deep or as wide as say the NIST cybersecurity framework, but it does tie in pretty good. And there's actually been projects where people have taken and mapped the NIST work alongside the NERC, and actively right now, Michael, there's a project at the CIWG, the Compliance Input Working Group, which is under the RSTC, the Reliability, Security, and Technical Committee of NERC, that's working on aligning the NIST cybersecurity framework with the current versions of NERC CIP.
You talk about the RSTC NERC group, and you've been on some NERC groups in the past as well, correct? And currently are.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm actually a member of the Compliance Input Working Group and working on that alignment project, the CSF and the CIP, and then I also work alongside of several others on the supply chain security standard as well as the cloud group, we'll call it.
Karl, how do you have time to do all this?
Hey, that stuff is fun to me, so
that's a good thing.
I fit in time, right? Because I mean, I honestly believe in giving back to the industry because the industry's been good to me over the last few decades.